They didn't pull away when you detached. They panicked. Avoidants expect emotional access to remain predictable, not constant intimacy, not closeness on demand, but availability when they reach, responsiveness when they circle back, openness that stays quietly waiting. The rhythm matters more than the depth. You were there. You answered. You stayed emotionally accessible even when they were inconsistent. That predictability regulated their nervous system without them realizing it. So when your emotional detachment happened, it wasn't read as distance, it was experienced as disruption. Because nothing external changed dramatically, you didn't lash out, you didn't threaten to leave, you didn't demand clarity, you simply stopped overextending emotionally. And that subtle shift landed harder than any confrontation ever could. Your detachment wasn't punishment, it wasn't strategy, it wasn't silence used as leverage. It was self-regulation. The moment you stopped offering emotional labor without reciprocity, the moment you stopped centering your internal world around their availability. And the avoidant nervous system is extremely sensitive to shifts in emotional access. When your emotional energy stopped orbiting them, they felt something unfamiliar rise internally. Not sadness first, not longing. Loss of control, not control over you, but control over the dynamic they had unconsciously relied on to feel safe without being fully present. Before, they could move toward and away without consequence. Your steady emotional presence absorbed the inconsistency. It softened the impact of their distancing, allowed them to maintain connection without fully engaging. When that presence quietly withdrew, the buffer disappeared. Suddenly, their distance had weight. Their silence echoed back to them. Their absence was no longer cushioned by your emotional availability. And that's when panic appears. Not dramatic panic, but internal destabilization, restlessness, hyper-awareness, a subtle pull toward you. They don't know how to name. This is the moment the power shifts, not because you gained leverage, but because you stopped stabilizing a one-sided system. Emotional detachment exposes imbalance. It removes the illusion that connection exists without effort. And for avoidance, effort triggers fear. Not because they don't care, but because effort requires presence, accountability, and emotional risk. Your calm detachment silently communicated something they weren't prepared to face. I can be connected without abandoning myself. That truth dismantles the familiar push-pull cycle they depend on. They didn't panic because you became distant. They panicked because you became self-contained, grounded, no longer emotionally hinging on their behavior. And that's destabilizing to someone who feels safest when connection exists without demand. Your detachment forced awareness of how much emotional regulation they were receiving without offering the same in return. Awareness of how the dynamic only worked when you carried more than your share. This is why the moment lingers for them, not because they suddenly want closeness, but because something fundamental changed. The system stopped working the way it always had, and they didn't know how to restore it without stepping forward, which is the one move they've trained themselves to avoid. They're not afraid of distance, they're afraid of independence. Avoidants are often misunderstood as people who fear closeness. In reality, they're far more comfortable with distance than most realize, as long as that distance is self-directed. Distance chosen by them feels safe. It feels regulating. It preserves autonomy without requiring explanation. What unsettles them isn't space itself, but the loss of authorship over the emotional landscape. As long as they are the one pulling back, the system stays familiar. They control the rhythm. They decide when connection pauses and when it resumes. But when you detach emotionally, calmly, without resentment, without protest, that control dissolves. Your calm removes their leverage. There is no tension to manage, no emotional reaction to calibrate against, no reassurance-seeking behavior to lean on. You're no longer waiting for them to return, no longer proving your value through consistency, no longer reacting to their inconsistencies with concern, explanation, or effort. And that absence of reaction is what destabilizes them most. Avoidants rely on emotional contrast. The push-pull dynamic allows them to stay engaged without fully committing. Your emotional responses, even when restrained, provided feedback. They could sense your presence, your availability, your investment. When your calm replaced that feedback loop, it created a vacuum. not an aggressive one, a quiet one. And quiet autonomy is confronting to someone who unconsciously depends on being emotionally central without being emotionally accountable. That kind of calm forces awareness because it leaves no one else to manage the emotional field. Your nervous system is regulated without them. Your stability is no longer contingent on their closeness or distance. And awareness is what avoidants work hardest to avoid. Awareness of impact, awareness of imbalance, awareness that the connection required more from the other person than from them. Your calm detachment removed the distraction of emotional negotiation and exposed the structure underneath. What they felt wasn't abandonment, it was displacement. The realization that they were no longer the emotional axis around which the dynamic revolved. Your independence communicated something they didn't know how to metabolize. You could care without clinging. That kind of emotional self-sufficiency challenges their core assumption. That closeness leads to dependency. You became living evidence that connection doesn't have to cost autonomy, and that contradiction creates internal conflict. This is why your calm felt threatening. It didn't demand anything from them. It didn't chase clarity. It didn't escalate. It simply existed. An existence without emotional reliance removes their ability to stay disengaged while still feeling connected. It introduces the possibility that intimacy could be mutual, or that it could end cleanly without drama. Both outcomes require choice, and choice requires presence. They weren't afraid you would leave. They were afraid you no longer needed them to feel stable. And that fear isn't about ego, it's about identity. Because when someone remains grounded without you, you can no longer define connection on your own terms. You either step forward into mutuality or you face the reality of distance without emotional cushioning. And that is the crossroads your calm quietly placed them at. They didn't lose you, they lost the reflection of themselves. Your emotional presence functioned as a mirror long before either of you consciously recognized it. Not a flattering mirror, a regulating one. It softened their emotional edges. It buffered the sharpness of their avoidance. It absorbed the fallout of their inconsistency without demanding immediate accountability. When they pulled away, your steadiness kept the connection intact. When they returned, your openness made re-entry easy. Your emotional availability allowed them to see themselves as connected without having to stay present. And that mirror made the dynamic feel safer than it actually was. In that role, you weren't just a partner, you were an emotional surface they bounced against. Your reactions gave them context. Your patience reduced friction. Your understanding filled in the gaps where their presence should have been. The mirror allowed them to move through the relationship without fully confronting the consequences of their distancing. Because as long as you remained emotionally accessible, their patterns never fully landed back on them. They didn't have to feel the full weight of their withdrawal. You carried part of it. When you detached, the mirror disappeared, not dramatically, not with accusation or closure speeches. It vanished quietly, the way mirrors do when the light shifts. And suddenly, there was nothing reflecting them back in softened form. No emotional buffering, no interpretation, no one absorbing the inconsistency and making it make sense. The space you created forced their patterns to exist on their own, unedited and unreflected. Now they had to sit alone with their patterns, with the rhythm of approach and retreat that once felt harmless, with the distance they created and never fully acknowledged, with the emotional impact of their behavior. Not filtered through your empathy, not softened by your reassurance. That internal confrontation is deeply uncomfortable for avoidants because it requires them to experience themselves without relational anesthesia. Silence becomes deafening in that space, not because nothing is happening, but because everything is finally landing. Without the mirror, they are left with internal noise they don't know how to regulate. Restlessness, rumination, a vague sense of loss that doesn't feel like missing you in the traditional sense, but missing what you provided, and that distinction is hard for them to articulate. They don't just feel your absence, they feel the absence of regulation, reflection, and emotional continuity. This is why detachment feels so final to them, even when no doors were slammed. You didn't disappear, you stopped reflecting, and without that reflection, they were left face to face with themselves. That moment doesn't always produce insight or change, but it always produces discomfort because for the first time, their emotional patterns are no longer shared. They are solely theirs to hold. They didn't lose you in the way people usually mean loss. They lost the mirror that made their avoidance feel invisible, and that loss is destabilizing. Because once someone has seen themselves reflected in softness, the absence of that reflection leaves a clarity they can't unsee. They knew something was wrong, but couldn't explain it. Avoidants often experience emotion somatically before they can make sense of it. Cognitively, sensations arrive first. Language comes later, if it comes at all. Their nervous systems register shifts long before their minds can organize them into meaning. So when you detached emotionally, what surfaced wasn't a clear thought like I miss them or I'm afraid of losing them. What surfaced was discomfort without a label, a sort of internal misalignment. They couldn't trace to a single cause. They felt unsettled, not dramatically distressed, just off, restless in ways they couldn't soothe, their attention drifting back to you without intention, a subtle pull that didn't align with their self-image of being independent and unaffected. And because avoidants rely heavily on self-sufficiency to maintain equilibrium, any internal disturbance that doesn't resolve through withdrawal feels threatening. They couldn't explain why they were thinking about you more, or why the absence of your emotional presence felt louder than expected. All they knew was that something familiar was gone. What disappeared wasn't the relationship itself, it was the regulation it provided. Your emotional presence had been a stabilizing force. Even when things were inconsistent, it created continuity, predictability, a background sense of connection that allowed them to move freely without losing their footing. When that regulation stopped, their nervous system noticed immediately. But without emotional language or reflective practice, they couldn't link the sensation to its source. They only felt the loss, not the mechanism behind it. This is where confusion sets in. Avoidants aren't taught to move toward emotional discomfort. They're conditioned to move away from it. So instead of reaching for clarity, they try to outrun the sensation. They distract themselves, rationalize, minimize, convince themselves nothing has changed. But the body doesn't lie. And the body remembers patterns even when the mind resists acknowledgement. The absence of your emotional availability created a physiological discrepancy they couldn't think their way out of. They didn't know how to get it back without reaching. And reaching violates their core strategy for safety. It requires vulnerability without certainty. It means admitting that something outside of themselves mattered more than they're comfortable with. So they remain caught in an internal loop, aware that something has shifted, but unable to move toward repair without confronting their own conditioning. This is why they often appear distant, yet preoccupied, detached, yet attentive. They might hover at the edges of your life, checking in indirectly or resurfacing casually, trying to restore equilibrium without explicit engagement. Not because they've made a conscious choice, but because their nervous system is searching for the regulation it lost. They knew something was wrong. They just didn't have the words for it. And without language, they couldn't transform feeling into action. So the discomfort lingered, unresolved, unnamed, and quietly tethered to the moment your emotional presence stopped doing the work for them. They don't chase, they monitor. When emotional detachment occurs, avoidants rarely respond with pursuit in the traditional sense. They don't rush in with declarations or demands for clarity. That kind of direct engagement feels too exposing, too destabilizing. Instead, they shift into observation. Monitoring becomes the compromise between desire and fear. It allows proximity without vulnerability, information without intimacy. So they watch quietly from the edges. They check your social media, not obsessively, but consistently. They ask mutuals about you under the guise of casual conversation. They resurface indirectly. A reaction to a story, a neutral message, a seemingly accidental encounter. These behaviors aren't strategic in the way people often assume. They're regulatory, a way to recalibrate their nervous system without crossing the line into emotional risk. This isn't because they've healed. It's not because they're suddenly ready for closeness or accountability. And it's not a sign that they've reached clarity about what they want. It's because your emotional absence created an internal imbalance they don't know how to resolve on their own. The system they relied on, where your presence softened the impact of their distance, no longer exists. Monitoring becomes a way to restore a sense of connection without re-entering the relationship fully. They're drawn to the regulation you once provided, even if they can't name it as such. Your emotional availability offered stability without demand. It allowed them to feel connected without feeling consumed. When that regulation disappeared, their nervous system went searching for it, not through communication, but through observation. Watching you offers a diluted version of connection. It soothes without requiring reciprocity. There's also a quiet reassurance they seek in monitoring. Are you okay without me? Not because they want you to suffer, but because your stability challenges the narrative that distance protects everyone. If you're thriving, grounded, unaffected, it confirms what they fear most, that the connection was sustained by your emotional labor, not by mutual effort. And that realization is uncomfortable. So they hover, not close enough to be vulnerable, not far enough to let go. This liminal space allows them to avoid the two outcomes they fear most: being needed or being irrelevant. Monitoring keeps the door psychologically open without requiring them to walk through it. From the outside, this behavior can look confusing or even manipulative, but internally, it's driven by dysregulation. They don't know how to approach without risking rejection or exposure, and they don't know how to detach completely without confronting loss. So they stay suspended, watching, tracking, waiting for a shift that would make reaching feel safer. They aren't trying to reclaim you, they're trying to reclaim equilibrium. The problem is, regulation borrowed from afar never fully settles the nervous system. It only postpones the moment of choice. And as long as your emotional presence remains unavailable, monitoring becomes the only way they know to stay connected without breaking the rules that taught them never to need. Without saying a word, you change the terms. Your emotional detachment wasn't loud. It didn't arrive with ultimatums, explanations, or emotional displays meant to be understood. It communicated through absence of overfunctioning, through the removal of behaviors that once kept the connection afloat. And in doing so, it rewrote the rules of the dynamic without ever needing to be announced. That's why it landed so strongly. Because nothing confuses an avoidant nervous system more than a boundary that doesn't demand acknowledgement. What your detachment actually said was simple and profound. I can be connected without being consumed. You demonstrated that intimacy doesn't require self-erasure, that caring doesn't mean carrying the emotional weight alone. You stopped proving your investment through availability and started embodying it through self-respect. That shift removed the assumption that connection automatically grants access to your emotional labor. It also said, I can care without chasing. You didn't withdraw into coldness. You didn't punish or perform indifference. You simply stopped pursuing clarity, reassurance, and reciprocity that wasn't being offered. For avoidance, pursuit is familiar. It reinforces their role as the one being reached for, chosen, returned to. When pursuit ends without resentment, it disrupts the hierarchy. You're no longer positioned beneath their autonomy. You're standing beside it. And perhaps most destabilizing of all, your detachment said, I can walk without resentment. You didn't collapse into bitterness or demand recognition for what you gave. That absence of emotional charge removed the drama that often allows avoidance to justify distance. There was nothing to push against, nothing to label as too much. Just a quiet assertion of wholeness that didn't require their validation. This wasn't abandonment. Abandonment is sudden, punitive, and emotionally loaded. What you did was regulated, intentional, rooted in self-preservation rather than protest. And emotional maturity is deeply unsettling to an avoidant nervous system because it eliminates the familiar push-pull cycle. That cycle creates safety through predictability, distance followed by return, silence followed by re-engagement. Your detachment ended the oscillation. Without the push, there's no pull. Without emotional overextension, there's no rebound. The dynamic flattens not into indifference, but into neutrality. And neutrality forces choice. It requires them to decide whether they can meet you in mutual presence or accept the distance as real. There's no longer an automatic bridge built by your effort. This is why your detachment didn't feel like rejection to them. It felt like a structural change. The system they understood stopped functioning. Not because you removed love, but because you removed emotional asymmetry. You no longer made it safe for them to remain avoidant while still feeling connected. And that's the message they couldn't ignore. Connection with you now required participation, not pursuit, not performance, presence. And when presence becomes the cost of closeness, avoidants feel destabilized because the rules they learned for staying safe no longer apply. This wasn't a tactic, it was alignment. You didn't detach to provoke a reaction. You didn't step back to trigger longing or engineer regret. That framing belongs to power games, and this wasn't one. Your detachment happened because something inside you recalibrated. You stopped negotiating with discomfort. You stopped explaining yourself into exhaustion. You stopped contorting your emotional truth to keep connection alive. What you did wasn't strategic withdrawal, it was return. A return to yourself. And that distinction matters because avoidants don't respond to tactics the way people think they do. They sense intention before behavior. When detachment is performative, it feels manipulative. When it's rooted in self-alignment, it feels immovable. Yours was the latter. You didn't detach to be seen. You detached because you finally saw yourself. And paradoxically, that's when avoidants feel you most. Not because they crave distance. That's the myth. Avoidants don't seek absence. They seek safety. They crave connection that doesn't come with emotional debt. Connection that doesn't silently invoice them for presence, reassurance, or future commitment. When you were emotionally overavailable, even in subtle ways, it created pressure, not because you asked for too much, but because the imbalance was unsustainable. Your detachment removed that pressure, and in doing so, it removed the justification for staying distant. Your wholeness changed the emotional temperature of the dynamic. You were no longer reaching for them to regulate your sense of self. You weren't scanning for signs, interpreting silence, or holding space for potential. You were grounded where you stood. That groundedness is disarming because it introduces a form of intimacy that doesn't require performance. Intimacy through self-containment. Avoidants are drawn to that kind of presence, even when they can't approach it. It represents connection without entanglement. Care without consumption, love without loss of autonomy. Your detachment showed them that closeness doesn't have to cost identity. And that realization creates both attraction and fear. Attraction because it contradicts their core belief that intimacy leads to engulfment. Fear because it removes the excuse that distance is necessary for safety. You proved something without saying it. You were whole without them, not hardened, not closed, whole. And wholeness shifts the relational field. It means connection becomes optional, not essential, chosen, not clung to. That's when avoidants feel the full weight of what's possible. Not because they miss you in the conventional sense, but because they sense the loss of an opportunity to connect without dysfunction. They may not articulate this, they may not even consciously recognize it, but your detachment recalibrated their internal compass. You stopped being someone they could return to without effort. You became someone they would have to meet, and meeting requires presence, risk, emotional participation. That's the crossroads your alignment quietly placed them at. They didn't struggle because you pulled away. They struggled because you didn't collapse. Your emotional detachment didn't punish them. It didn't abandon them. It didn't teach them a lesson. It exposed the imbalance that had been there all along. When you stopped overfunctioning, the system lost its scaffolding. When you stopped carrying the connection alone, the weight redistributed. When you stopped buffering their avoidance, their patterns finally landed where they belong. In the stillness you created, there was no drama to deflect responsibility, no emotional chaos to blame, no reaction to manage, just the quiet consequence of distance without insulation. And that stillness was unbearable, not because you were gone, but because you were no longer compensating. They finally felt the weight of their own patterns, the rhythm of approach and retreat without your emotional labor to soften it, the silence without your reassurance to fill it, the distance without your patience to neutralize it. Not because you tried to teach them, but because you stopped protecting them from themselves. That's the part they couldn't handle. Not your absence, but your solidity. Not the loss of connection, but the loss of imbalance. You didn't collapse into longing. You didn't spiral into explanation. You didn't abandon yourself to be chosen. You chose yourself and let that choice stand without negotiation. And whether they heal or not, whether they reach or not, whether they change or not, that moment imprints because it's rare. A person who cares without clinging, who detaches without resentment, who leaves without disappearing, that kind of presence doesn't fade easily. They'll remember it not as rejection, but as reckoning. The moment the dynamic stopped bending around their avoidance, the moment connection required more than distance management, the moment you remained whole and they realized they could no longer stay the same.